what's he going to do? He's got the third! Oh, beautiful goal! What genius! What a save! Oh, a great goal!
Bateu violento, gol!
That was really fine, wasn't it? I've never seen one even close to that.
In the year 1586, Queen Elizabeth I ruled England. She decreed that HMS Sunshine sail to the New World in search of the Northwest Passage. When the ship docked at Gilbert Sound on the west coast of Greenland, the first North American international soccer game took place. As the crew of HMS Sunshine played the local Eskimos while awaiting clearing of the icebound passage. It was the first form of organized team sport to arrive on this side of the Atlantic. As to the exact soccer rules applied back then, nobody can say for sure. In fact, as to who exactly invented the beautiful game is a legacy claimed by many and proved by none. It is now over 400 years since that match in Gilbert Sound. Yet strangely, to this very day, soccer is still considered an ethnic fringe sport by the majority of the American sports fans and media. And its very survival has been tenuous at best. The question we will try to answer is, why? It was said long ago, no one regards what is before his feet, we all gaze at the stars. All except soccer players. This soccer protagonist in the New World had certainly done his little bit of stargazing. He is Gerrit Smith Miller, the originator and captain of the very first known soccer team in the USA. Soccer balls back then were not anything like today. This is the oldest known soccer ball still in existence. It was manufactured in 1863 by Charles Goodyear using vulcanized rubber. Goodyear's new soccer ball so impressed the officials at the 1855 Paris Universal World Fair that they presented him with a prestigious award. Unfortunately, they had to travel to the debtor's prison to make that award, as Goodyear had been sent to prison for failing to pay his Paris hotel bill. Perhaps this was an omen of new world soccer debts to follow. Soccer even made its mark at the college level. This is a picture taken of the Rutgers College soccer team following their 6-4 win over Princeton University. It was the first intercollegiate soccer match ever played in the USA. And by the year 1870, England, considered by many the mother of the game, already had soccer stars. And this soccer craze and club fever brought about the English Football Association Cup, which kicked off in 1871. The bookies' favourites in that first ever FA Cup final were the Royal Engineers, but they lost 1-0 to the Wanderers before a crowd of 2,000 fans at the Kennington Oval. And by 1874, Queen's Park was winning the first ever Scottish Cup final. In fact, it was about this time that the game began to take off in North America. On Christmas Day in 1884, America hosted a Canadian team in St. Louis. The game was won 9-0 by the Canadians. It was the first ever recorded North American international match. 4 years later, in 1888, marked the formation of the English League by William McGregor. And in that same year, Canada felt so confident about their soccer skills that they had the audacity to send a team of 17 players across the seas to play against the British elite. A daring move indeed.
Yes, indeed, it was a daring move, because this was the era of the horse and buggy, and those people who decided to go would face a 5-week trip across the Atlantic by steam in the days when this was a hazardous journey. And then each of the players would have to get 6 months off work, have to raise $200 or put up $200 to make the trip at a time when people didn't earn very much.
25 years earlier, William McGregor had founded the English Football Association, a date that marks a point at which modern football can be said to have begun. But it only rated 3 columns in the Times. Today, the game is known in North America as soccer. It is an abbreviation of the word association. This was an era littered between the new and the old world. Horse-drawn carriages to the game, not quite the sexy uniforms of today, and strange-looking programs. Towns were abuzz with all forms of transportation. This was Victorian England, a time of extreme contrast between rich and poor, city and country, the have and the have-nots. And the same similarities existed all over North America.
The Canadian touring team of 1888 began their tour in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where they played the top 4 Irish teams in 5 days and won every game and outscored their opponents 13-7. They then crossed the Irish Sea to Scotland, where they played Glasgow Rangers and held them to a 1-1 tie. They moved on to Edinburgh, where they played Hearts and won 3-0 before dropping down into England. And in England, they started off in Sunderland, where they lost. And then they played a team called Newton Heath. And Newton Heath today is known as Manchester United. And they beat Newton Heath. They had an incredible record of having 9 wins and 9 losses and 5 ties against some of the best teams in England at that time. And some of those losses came right at the end of the tour when there were a lot of injuries, and they had to fill in by using more local players.
Amazingly, only one member of that team was born outside of Canada, and that one exception, David Forsyth, had arrived in Canada at the age of 1. The Brits were so impressed with the Canadian team that Canadian Walter Bowman was signed to a professional contract by Accrington Stanley, one of the original clubs of the English League, whose ground and team has been but a memory since 1962. Bowman was in fact the first ever foreign import to British soccer. By 1904, the Americans were busy opening the subway in New York City. They were also hosting the Olympics in St. Louis. And America literally ran away with the games. Canada took just 1 gold in track and field in what was called back then the weight thrower. It was also to be the last time that the sport of barrel jumping was to be a part of track and field. But a new sport was to take its place: soccer. And it was a little team from Galt, Ontario, Canada, who became overnight heroes as they beat the Americans twice, 7-0 and 4-0, to take the gold. A proud city of Galt not only turned out in their thousands to welcome the team home, they also designed a commemorative medal for the occasion. This medal was presented to right forward Fred Steep by the mayor of Galt. Steep was a standout player, and Galt went on to win over 40 Canadian and American championships during the next 25 years. Referees back then looked more like they were going on a hunting trip. And most players grew massive moustaches and wore their protective shin pads outside their socks. The game was fast growing in status, and agents were now traveling backwards and forwards from the USA, offering professional contracts to better players. Soccer matches in England were now attracting huge crowds. Politicians, much like today, were quick to pick up on this kind of opportunity. As an example, here British Prime Minister Asquith attends a match in Newcastle. This was a time of great unemployment, and unemployed protesters gathered at the game. Soccer and politics for them was little comfort to fill their hungry bellies. The first FA Cup final to be filmed took place at Crystal Palace in 1911, when Bradford City met Newcastle United. That first match ended in a draw, so the replay took place at Old Trafford, home of Manchester United. Bradford City went on to win the cup by 1-0 and were the first to claim the existing FA Cup before 66,000 paid fans. But professional sports was now facing stiff opposition for their dollars, because the silent movie industry was upon us. Originally, the movie settings shot in New York were pretty staged, with painted backdrops and little reality. But reality soon crept in when the movie industry moved to California and utilized the magnificent scenery to create the Western movies. This is the 1912 production of The Massacre. The world now had a new love. But love in our world was soon to die, for black clouds were now forming on the distant horizon. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife, the Duchess of Hohenberg, were assassinated. Because boldness is always a mask for fear, however great the cause, there was an immediate call to arms. It was shrill and demanding, and millions answered the call. The nightmare was upon us all, as World War I roared into our history books. The world was at war. Some claimed it was to be the war to end all wars. At this time, America was still at peace. And in 1916, they had sent their national soccer team to Scandinavia to play both Norway, who they tied, and Sweden, who they defeated 3-2. On May 8, 1915, the Germans made a fatal mistake when their submarine sunk the British liner, the Lusitania. Almost 1,000 civilian lives were lost. Among the dead were 124 Americans. The American government was outraged. Then in 1917, the Germans recklessly sunk 4 more American ships. Because of this, the United States and President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany.
The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. The world must be made safe for democracy.
Returned to peace on November the 11th, 1918, when the Germans finally capitulated and an armistice was signed. It was claimed to be a great victory, but the loss of so many honest men and women's lives could not be valued at any price. Shortly after, England's Prince of Wales toured Canada and reviewed veterans of World War I. The Prince then travelled to the USA, again reviewing veterans of World War I. While in Canada, a Scottish celebrity from Govan by the name of Archie Walker was in Toronto to kick off a new soccer season in front of a very large crowd. There was no consideration for camera coverage back then, as both teams appear to be wearing the same uniform. The United States, with 40% of its population being immigrants from the Old World, was also enjoying a successful emergence of soccer. This is a 1920 match played in New Bedford, Massachusetts, featuring the River Bay Staters and Bethlehem, playing for the United States Eastern Conference title. America was fast becoming the world's most industrious nation, and factories were springing up everywhere. For labor, they brought in hundreds of immigrants from Europe, who soon demanded factory soccer teams. It was their only contact with their former culture. So the Mills started a league. It became extremely popular, and thousands were paid to watch the games. The Mills then started to recruit not only workers from Europe, but also professional soccer players. The one condition of employment being they had to work a few hours at the mill to qualify to play in the league. Now mill teams were being selected strictly according to the players' ethnic origin. There were English, German, Scottish, and Dutch teams, each with excellent fan support. But this ethnic separation proved to be their downfall, because by the 30s, the USA was faced with the Great Depression, and many of the mills closed down, and the Mill League folded. Baseball and US football teams proudly carried the name of their hometown and gained the financial support of local merchants. Unfortunately, the majority of soccer clubs had taken a different route in the USA. They had made that fatal mistake of isolating its fans and team identity strictly on an international ethnic cultural basis. So when the mills closed, American soccer revenue sources and fan support closed down with them, leaving nothing but a memory. By 1925, Canada and the USA had arranged a series of international matches. This match was the second match of the series. It took place at Ebbets Field in New York City, and despite a torrential rain, 8,000 fans were in attendance. The caliber of play was, to put it mildly, atrocious. However, they did have the excuse that they were playing in a sea of mud. Canada had won the first match 1-0 in Montreal, but the Americans won the next two matches in New York City 6-1 and 6-2. Then came the Dirty 30s. Despite the Depression, teams traveled from Britain to play against American and Canadian semi-professional teams. The matches did nothing to fill the empty bellies, but it did give some relief from the abject misery of unemployment. This is a match played at the old Ulster Stadium, a stadium that has since been demolished. It featured Toronto Ulster United up against the famous Glasgow Rangers before a packed house. Action was sparse in the first half as the cameraman, for obvious reasons, concentrated on the Toronto goalie awaiting a Rangers goal. Rangers win the match 4-3, and the fans get their money's worth. At the conclusion of the match, Annabelle Walker, daughter of Archie Walker, presented the silver trophy to the winners. In 1930, Jules Rimet, the head of FIFA, the world governing body of soccer, introduced his World Cup tournament. It was to feature professional soccer players. This had come about because of the apparent lack of control by the Olympic soccer organizers. This was blatantly obvious in the 1924 Paris Olympics, when the soccer gold was won by Uruguay, whose national team was comprised of 90% known professional soccer players. As Olympic champions, Uruguay in 1930 were given the honor of hosting the first ever World Cup tournament. England ignored the new World Cup tournament, partly from pompous arrogance, plus they refused to play against teams from countries they had fought in World War I. The USA, however, did compete in that first World Cup tournament. It kicked off in Montevideo on July 13th, 1930. One of the American team members was James Brown.
It took them 14 days to travel by boat to Uruguay. They arrived in Uruguay, and strangely enough, they became the favorites of the locals. There was a very, very small community of expatriates. The Americans were known as the weightlifters. They trained very hard on the ship. They trained every day. They did physical training, no ball training. When they arrived, instead of being weary from the voyage, they were fit and ready to go. And they surprised the first two teams they met. My father tells a good story about the opening goal that was scored in the Belgium game. As it's written up, even in the manager's account, a brilliant run down the right wing and a powerful shot rebounded from the crossbar and went out to McGee at the edge of the box, who hammered it home. And I asked my father about that. Dad, you told me never to try shots from the wing. He said, I wasn't trying for a shot. It was a cross and I mishit it. But the records book shows it was a powerful shot. They hit the crossbar. But that was the first goal that was scored by the U.S. in their 3-0 win against Belgium. The U.S. finished third in this very first World Cup. One of his proudest possessions was his medal. That medal was the only international medal won by the U.S. in major competitions.
So the Americans proudly took home third-place medals and a great deal of honor. The final saw Uruguay defeat Argentina 4-2 to win the first ever World Cup of Soccer. The Americans again went to the World Cup final in 1934. This time it was an 8,000-mile return trip on the SS Roma to Italy. In the first match, the USA defeated Mexico 4-0. Mexico were eliminated and now faced the long journey home after just one match. The USA was soon to follow as they lost 7-1 to the hosts, Italy.
When Italy met the United States, there were 3 Argentinians in the squad. So the controversy was whether or not these Argentinian-born players should play for Italy. And of course, in those days, you have to go back and look at the regulations, and the regulations must have permitted that. But the Italian coach, Vittorio Pozzo, said at the time that if these players are good enough to fight for Italy in a war, they're good enough to play for Italy in the World Cup. The goal scored by the United States in that 7-1 loss to Italy was the last goal scored by the United States against Italy for 58 years.
In 1938, a respectable 32 nations were to enter the World Cup. It was staged in France. But this time the USA withdrew. The costs were just too high. Italy went to the final, defeating Hungary 4-2 and winning the last World Cup of soccer for the next 12 years. There was now a much bigger battle looming on the horizon with an even larger playing field. It is said, no matter how high a throne a king sits on, like the rest of us, he still sits on his bottom. One would have prayed back in 1939 that a maniac by the name of Adolf Hitler and his sidekick Benito Mussolini would have done just that. Yet again, the world was to be thrust into the nightmare of global warfare. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Poland's allies, England and France, declared war against Germany. Italy then joined in with Germany. The Germans had a plan: close the sea supply lines and send enough bombers over England to bomb England into submission.
The night we met, there was magic abroad in the air. There were angels dining at the Ritz, and a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. I may be right, I may be wrong, but I'm perfectly willing to swear that when you turned and smiled at me, a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. I know 'cause I was there that night in Berkeley Square.
The British Spitfires were to win the day, and England was safe from invasion.
We shall defend every village, every town, and every city. The vast mass of London itself, fought street by street, could easily devour an entire hostile army. And
Time was now on the side of the Allies.
The luck of the draw brought Canada and Norway together in the second round of the Inter-Allied Services Soccer Cup.
So the Allied troops took advantage of the break to get in some soccer.
Representing the Canadian Army,
Here the Canadian Armed Forces take on the Norwegians.
the game ended with the Norwegians on the long end of a 10-2 score.
On Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Sinking 10 ships. Over 3,000 U.S. servicemen were lost. The USA declared war on Japan. Hitler's Germany declared war on the USA. Three years later saw the greatest armada ever assembled to cross the English Channel. The Allied invasion of Europe had begun. The Allies relentlessly smashed the Nazis from land, sea, and air, forcing first Italy, then Germany to surrender. The free world now turned its full might against Japan. Then the US utilized the ultimate horror of war. Within a month, Japan surrendered. World War II finally came to an end. Following the end of the war, in the summer prior to the 1950 World Cup finals, a representative team from England traveled to New York to play a friendly against the Americans. Both the Americans and England had qualified for the World Cup finals, which were to be played in Brazil. The Americans were so totally unprepared, they didn't even have national soccer team shirts. So instead, they borrowed local collegiate football shirts, marked with the letter H. After the match, which the English had won convincingly, there was a banquet. Former referee Sir Stanley Rouse, secretary of the English Football Association and team manager, was asked to speak. And typical of the English soccer arrogance that prevailed at that time, Sir Stanley announced that though the Americans had done well in defeat, they had better get ready for a real soccer lesson at the World Cup in Brazil, where they would face the full British team. Mind you, England were 3-1 favourites, while the Americans were 500-1 outsiders. But even bookies can get it wrong. Here is Harry Keogh, a member of that amazing 1950 American World Cup team.
When we found out in St. Louis before we left it, we were in the same group with Spain, England, and Chile. You know, right away we thought, oh boy, you know, England had never played in the World Cup before. They were the #1 soccer nation, the inventors of the game, and so we thought that we would have been lucky to be within 2 goals of any of those 3 teams. With 5 minutes to go, we were winning 1-0, and I couldn't have been more surprised. I think everybody was surprised, you know, thinking it was all going to end with England scoring a goal and tying it up or going ahead, but because that had happened in the previous game against Spain. So, you know, the idea that, you know, eventually England was going to come through was in our minds, but we were fighting very hard. And of course, had it not been for our goalie, Frank Borghi, you know, I think I wouldn't be here doing this interview today. Actually, the crowd was a big reason for us winning that game, because they were for us to a man. Every time an English player took the ball away from us, silence. Every time we took or maybe went by an English player or won a block ball, the crowd cheered wildly. So that was a very important part of us winning the game. I know fans don't kick a ball in the goal, but basically, I've never played where the crowd was more in my favor, even when I played, you know, at a home team in St. Louis. They carried Joe Gaetjens, the fellow who scored the goal, off the field, and I think they carried John Sousa off the field, and I think they carried Frank Borghi off the field, the goalie, and I thought they made excellent choices. I was impressed no end by the way the English players handled that. You know, when they must have really been hurting, you know. Yeah, because the remark I made to Frank Wallace, I said, these guys will never live this down. Us beating England was the furthest thing from our mind that day, and you know, it was certainly a miracle.
The Canadian and American soccer elite had suffered devastating losses during World War II. And as immigration in both countries was now at an all-time high, one would have thought that the sport of soccer would be the first to prosper from this fast-changing world. But with Canada now desperately seeking its own identity separate from that of the United Kingdom, and the USA was busy demanding of all its citizens total assimilation into the American patriotic dream, soccer began to drift into the wilderness. Now the beautiful game began to experience the strange phenomena of almost total ethnic support. This was both a blessing and a curse on soccer in the New World. To be honest, it certainly helped the continued survival of the game, as ethnic named teams like Toronto Italia received good fan support. But American and Canadian fans attending soccer games now found themselves isolated among local ethnic fans. These fans were enthusiastically volatile and spoke a different language, leaving many soccer fans feeling very uncomfortable and, even worse, not very welcome at a sporting event being played in their own country. The game suffered accordingly and was ostracized by many of the mainstream media, national corporate sponsors, and potential fans. A sport that had prevailed since the beginning of the New World was now unfairly being categorized as simply a new ethnic sport. An erroneous name tag that continues to haunt soccer to this very day. George Gross witnessed firsthand the difficulty of selling soccer in Canada.
I became involved with Toronto City in 1960. Now, Toronto City, we had no team, we had no players. So Steve Stavro and I, we agreed we have to get some British players. I knew Danny Blanchflower. Well, Danny Blanchflower was the captain of Tottenham and the captain of Northern Ireland. He says, I'll sign, and you should sign Stanley Matthews. Well, Stanley Matthews was in soccer in Britain like Wayne Gretzky in hockey. I mean, the greatest player.
A legend in his own lifetime. Such a man is Stanley Matthews, the greatest footballer the world has ever known.
Now, that wasn't enough. I said, who else could we get? So Blanchflower said, well, it'd be nice to get Johnny Haynes. Well, Johnny Haynes was the captain of England. I signed him for big money, and Johnny Haynes agreed to play. And that, for the first time and the last time, that the captain of Northern Ireland, the captain of England, and the captain of Scotland, who was Tommy Younger, the goaltender, who later became president of the Scottish FA, played for the same team in league competition. It never happened before and never happened since. So we had sellout crowds, but only as long as these top players were with us, which was to the start of the British season. Then they had to go back. The attendance dropped from 21,000 down to 6,000.
We were now in the swinging 60s, a time of flower children and miniskirts, a time when all things seemed possible, a time when we could all dream the impossible dream. And coming to America were two men whose dreams would change everything and set the soccer crossbar at a height yet unknown in America. They were Clive Toye and Phil Woosnam.
My intent was to stay for about 2 years and go back into management into England.
But at the end of the 1968 season, by that time, two leagues had merged. United Soccer Association and the National Professional Soccer League had merged together to form the North American Soccer League. But unfortunately, at the end of that season, we dropped in membership from 17 teams down to 5. Those 5 decided to continue. But shortly after the season started, one of the 5 decided that they would not continue, the Baltimore franchise. But we did not reveal that. So my first task was to go and recruit 2 more teams, if possible, to come into the league so that we would gradually grow to where we eventually reached. And so we survived what was probably the nearest thing we did come to not existing at all. That was critical, that we had a New York franchise in professional sports in the United States. Otherwise, you're non-existent.
Phil Woosnam and I were then running the league from the visitors' locker room in Atlanta Stadium because we had no money to pay rent. And then in 1971, having found what we thought were the right owners for New York, I became the general manager, later president of the Cosmos. This was a long time ago. This was when soccer was still in its infancy in the United States, when the United States national team, for example, instead of drawing 30, 40, 50,000 people to see them play, we'd be lucky if their wives and aunts and uncles turned up to see them play. It was a totally nothing sport. We had like 250,000 total players in the country instead of the 18 million that we now have. And the idea of American players playing professionally in the best leagues in Europe, I mean, it was at that time unthinkable. So the one player whose name was known, and if his name wasn't known, there was an awareness that there was this super Brazilian guy, and the Brazilian guy, of course, being Pelé.
Now at that point, Clive takes over, and Clive was the one who pursued him for the next few years, and ultimately we were successful in Pelé coming into the league, of course, which was a major turning point.
I started talking to him in March of 1971, and he eventually signed a contract in June of 75, and of course then played for us for the next 3 years, and did everything that we hoped he would do, which was bring enormous media attention and crowd after crowd of 77,000, 78,000 at Giant Stadium and huge crowds everywhere else. It cost to hire Pelé a lot less than people thought. I mean, I've seen all kinds of figures, but in fact it cost 2.8 million for 3 years of playing and for his worldwide marketing rights for many more, I think for 10 years altogether. So we didn't just buy Pelé the player, we bought Pelé the brand, and that was a very, very valuable piece of business.
Pelé and the Cosmos were now the center of every soccer fan's attention. But a team in Canada was about to steal their thunder. And the North American Soccer League watched in abject misery as their worst public relations nightmare came true.
The North American Soccer League's ultimate destination. Soccer Bowl 76.
An ethnic-named team, Toronto Metro Croatia, was about to make it to the 1976 NASL Soccer Bowl. One of Toronto Croatia's star players was Bobby Arushi.
1976 with the Toronto Metros Croatia was the greatest soccer year of my life. Not only did I play with impeccable, cagey soccer veterans, but I also played with Eusebio. Eusebio, the Black Panther of Portugal. Eusebio was the first of the great superstars that I had the privilege of playing with. And I'll never forget the day that he walked into Lamport Stadium, and he walked into that door and I saw him. It was almost like I just saw Moses coming down from the mount with the 10 Commandments. It was incredible. And if Carmen Marcantoni was here, we would both, our eyes would just gleam thinking about that moment when we saw the great Eusebio. We went on a 9-game winning streak with the new coach. Eusebio was made captain, and we eventually we beat Chicago, we beat Rochester, Chicago, and Tampa Bay in Tampa Bay 2-0 to go to the final in Seattle against Minnesota, and everybody wanted us to lose because, of course, we were the Metros Croatia. How dare you have an ethnic name attached to a city? The NASL were growing in marketing and having this upstart group of how could you put a foreign stranger guys with the Metros Croatia handle on it. these guys couldn't possibly win, and yet we went on to play a brilliant game and beautiful soccer. I have the tape at home. I think I watch it like once a month or so because it just reminds me of that marvelous moment. We eventually won 3-0 at the Kingdom.
Toronto is champion of all of North America.
Now it's June. We had just beaten Tulsa, and I went on a golf game with Jelko Bilecki. And when I came back home, my mom was making us some pasta, and the phone rang. And my mother had this incredible look on her face, and she said, "I don't know who it is, but I don't like the sound of it." And I picked up the phone. It was Eddie Fermani, the coach of the Cosmos, who in about 30 seconds told me that I was just been purchased by the Cosmos. I had a prepaid ticket at the airport, and I was to be met at LaGuardia, where the next day there would be, you know, I would be practicing with my new club, the New York Cosmos. Of course, I was devastated. I didn't want to leave Toronto. I was part of a championship team. How could they do this to me, the Croatians? So I actually called Sam Peric, the general manager, and I gave him heck. I said, "Sam, how could you do this?" And Sam was trying to explain to me that this was the best thing for me for my career. Of course, I wouldn't have anything of it, and I ended up hanging up on him. Of course, when I got to New York, and I was picked up by a limo, and they took me to the Americana Hotel, and that night I had dinner with Carlos Alberto and Pelé. And then I was, the next morning in a limo, they took me to Giant Stadium, and I had a cubicle probably 4 times the size of the three hooks I had at Lamport Stadium, right? And they had an Alessi robe and talcum powder and underarm deodorant and slippers and new pony shoes. And I got on the field, and of course I practiced with this star-studded mob, and then that afternoon was escorted to 75 Rockefeller Plaza on the 19th floor and asked to sign a contract. And I went from $5,000 to $25,000.
As this toured Robert Iarussi, Steve Hunt scoring play typified excellent teamwork in another 5-1 romp.
And so that night I picked up the phone, I called Sam Peric, and I apologized profusely, telling him if there's anything I could do for him in the future. Of course, he hung up on me after that. But that was some memory. I'll never forget that, you know, from rags to riches.
In fact, by 1977, the entire North American Soccer League had gone from rags to riches, both in crowds and sponsorship, as they showcased a vast array of world-class soccer stars. But the facts were the North American Soccer League was to prove to be as fragile as a leaf. And like a leaf in autumn, the North American Soccer League clubs would all eventually wither away.